Thank you. I shall try to make my argument as succinct as Tony. Russia's waging an aggressive war against Ukraine. It's not acting in self-defense because Ukraine did not attack Russia. There may be reasons, we've heard some, why Vladimir Putin ordered the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of February 22, and it may be interesting to explore these reasons. But to be clear, they are not justifications for an aggressive war. There can be no justifications for an aggressive war. In the West, we normally consider the just war tradition when assessing justifications made for the use of armed force. In this tradition, there's an important distinction between cause and conduct, why and how. A just cause means that a war must be undertaken by a lawful authority with good intent to right a serious wrong and be undertaken with a reasonable prospect of success, and then only after exhausting peaceful alternatives and using proportionate means. Just conduct requires not making matters worse, using force proportionate to the wrong to be righted, and sparing non-combatants. So a war needs special justification and men should be fought as humanely as possible. On almost every one of these tests, Russian aggression fails. Let me emphasize here that the question of how a war should be fought is bound up with whether it should be fought at all. I'm not going to labour this point today, but it's important to note that even if the Russian government had kidded itself that this would be a walkover, that it is still stuck in a hopeless campaign after well over 3 years of fighting against a supposedly weaker country with an illegitimate government. Moscow's lack of understanding of Ukraine's determined and resilient national identity is another indicator of Russia's moral as well as military failure. It had no idea of the mess it was getting into and the tragedy it was inflicting upon itself as well as Ukraine. Tim invites us to peer into Putin's head, which is a strange place to go, but if we're going to go, we have to perhaps consider this like a psychiatrist dealing with a patient with paranoia. We may discover that our patient harbours deep and dark thoughts about NATO as well as about Ukraine. And these generate a sense of profound insecurity. That seems to me to be the argument. And sometimes, of course, the paranoid are right. They're right to be worried. But if we discover that there's no reason for them to worry, we may have an explanation for the consequential criminality. They did this terrible thing because they were deranged, but we have no justification. If the Russian government had not fallen prey to its own insecurities and considered the situation more carefully, it would have held fire. We must also be careful because Putin and his propagandists have given a variety of reasons for the invasion at different times. In some accounts, NATO enlargement doesn't enlarge, but in most, and in particular Putin's famous essay of July 2021 on, quotes, the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, NATO is mentioned only once as exercising control over the Ukrainian government, because it's a theme of what the Russians say, that Ukraine has no agency of its own. But the purpose of Putin's tendentious history is to demonstrate that Ukraine has no right to exist as an independent state, that it is an artificial creation and has an illegitimate government and should therefore return to its proper home. And that, I believe, is Putin's core motive. When Russians speak about the root causes that must be addressed if the conflict is to be resolved, they do tend to refer to NATO enlargement, but they also refer to an issue that hasn't been mentioned, is the position of Russian speakers inside Ukraine, although I have to say most Ukrainian Russian speakers that I know are desperately concentrating on their Ukrainian and don't want to speak Russian again. On NATO expansion, we've got to deal with this issue that was ever a firm promise. It was never a firm promise. And the discussions that have been mentioned took place in the context of NATO, of German reunification, when the Soviet Union was still whole. And it was not the collapsed Soviet Union that turned into 15 states. You can find comments by German Foreign Minister Genscher about the possibility of no NATO expansion, but he was countermanded by Chancellor Kohl, who vetoed the idea. Tony's mentioned the Founding Act. Yeltsin praised the Founding Act. He welcomed the Founding Act of 1997 when it came. This set up a joint NATO-Russia permanent joint council to serve as a venue for consultation, cooperation and consensus building. The two sides insisted that they did not see each other as enemies and also promised to refrain from, quote, the threat or use of force against each other as well as against any other state, its sovereignty, territorial integrity or political independence. So there was no promise against enlargement here, but there was a promise not to use force. The essential principle was that sovereign states could choose their own security arrangements, and that this could include membership of NATO. The important point about enlargement was that it was demand-led and not supply-led. NATO didn't go around saying, you've got to join us or else. Countries wanted to join NATO. Former members of the Soviet bloc were actively campaigning for this. Now, we don't know what the counterfactual would have been if NATO and the EU had not expanded and reflected this demand. But it's hard to believe that keeping so many states outside of established support structures would have been more stable and mutually beneficial. And I don't think if you went around to these new members of NATO now, do you really think this was a bad idea? Do you really wish you hadn't bothered? You'll find many takers. Most of them are really very pleased now to be members of the alliance. And you've got to also to remember that the history of these countries is of betrayal. The betrayal of Munich in 1938 and the betrayal in Yalta in February 1945 when they were consigned to the Soviet sphere. In the discussion prior to the full-scale invasion, NATO offered to go back to the Founding Act, which in 2014 had fallen into disrepute. They promised non-aggression, no offensive weapons would get too close. We know from a recent statement by Putin that Biden promised that he would exclude NATO, Ukraine from NATO for the next 5 to 8 years at least. And in fact, since the Bucharest summit has been mentioned, which was an absolutely sloppy piece of diplomacy, but what was clear was nothing was done then to make Ukraine a member of NATO, which is, that was a long time ago, and no moves had been made, nor would have been made if Russia hadn't invaded. And even now, it's still pretty difficult to see how this is going to happen. So why Putin's paranoia? I think it goes back to the Orange Revolution of 2004, when popular protest forced a rerun of a presidential election, which was widely assumed to be rigged, and which saw the pro-Western candidate poisoned, which is why he disappeared. After that, he was keen for Ukraine to be brought back into the Russian sphere. In 2013, he became alarmed that Viktor Yanukovych, as pro-Russian a Ukrainian president as you're ever likely to get, was going to sign an association with the agreement with the EU, not NATO. And he put Ukraine under extraordinary economic coercion to get the government to change its mind. And when he did so, when Yanukovych changed his mind, that's what prompted the Revolution of Dignity and led to the terrible events that we've seen unfolding. What Putin finds objectionable is not Ukraine's friendship, but its agency, its right to make its own decision and chart its own course. He was especially alarmed that he might turn into a Western democracy, for that might have been contagious and infected Russia. The creation of the pretext for the invasion followed the pattern of 2014 with an attempt to suggest that Russia was responding to a desperate plea from a beleaguered population, nothing to do with NATO. There are no honourable motives justifying Russian aggression against Ukraine. It was a terrible choice made for bad reasons. Whatever the faults of Western policy, it did not goad Russia into invading a sovereign country, occupying its land, bombing its cities, plundering its assets, murdering its people, abducting its children. Putin doesn't deserve our legitimation or our apologies. He deserves only condemnation and the determination to make sure that this reckless, shameful and unwarranted invasion is defeated.